Good day, everybody. My name is Mark Shaw. Welcome to the launch of the 2020 report of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, a very important report covering the issue of organized crime. We're recording today's discussion in a virtual format because of the pandemic. And the pandemic provides a particular framework around which to discuss an issue like organized crime, which is a global phenomenon itself. And so this particular report, Enforcement of Drug Laws, Refocusing on Organized Crime Elites, comes at a very particular and significant time. The report makes some very significant recommendations, both for national responses, for regional responses, and particularly for the global multilateral response to organized crime. The Global Commission itself is a really unique body. It was founded in 2011, and it consists of 26 commissioners. Now, those commissioners are really high-profile people. 14 of them are former heads of state, and we have some of those commissioners online with us today to discuss the report. The chairperson of the Commission, Ruth Dreifuss, a former president of Switzerland, who has been key to driving forward the work of the Commission. Louise Arbour is a prominent Canadian jurist with a distinguished international career, including as the UN Commissioner on Human Rights. Helen Clark is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, as well as the former UNDP administrator, with long experience of the multilateral system. Anand Grover, a prominent Indian jurist with a long record of advocating for human rights. And Juan Manuel Santos, a former president of Colombia and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Ruth, it's really a pleasure to speak with you this morning. What is the background to the Global Commission?
Thank you, Mark. The first thing I want to do is to say hello to everybody and to present the Global Commission on Drug Policy. On one side, we have the dramatic experience of our Latin American fellows who experienced in the first decade of the millennium a dramatic situation where the state institution, the rule of law, was threatened by the international traffic on drugs and the different cartels. In the meantime, in Europe, leaders were facing another dramatic challenge, and that was the situation of the people who consume drugs, the threat also of overdoses and marginalization of these people, the criminalization of the people, the fact that they were really at the margin of the society. And in both regions, leaders tried to show that it was a consequence of the prohibition and incapacity to deal with the real problems of criminality, the real problems of health, and so on. So this was the beginning. But step by step, we got global. We had fellows in Africa under the leadership of the late Kofi Annan. We could also enlarge to Asia, to the Pacific region. And now we are a group of 26 people, I would say world leaders from the political, cultural, economic life, who feel that it is their responsibility to share their experience and to show that it is possible, that it is necessary to change drug policy in order to avoid all these consequences.
Core to the work of the Commission has been a strategy around 5 pathways. Can you tell us a little bit about what those pathways cover?
It is putting health first. It is also giving priority to the need that to consider also some of these substances under their medical possibility. It is one of the dramatic situations also, mainly in poor countries, that the people have no access to painkillers. Well, the third pathway we think is very, very important is really to end the criminalization of the people who use drugs. The fourth chapter of our reform program is that we have to deal with the criminality. And this is the reason why today we present this report of the Commission. And the last point, we have to take control. The state, reasonable and responsible people have to take the control of the drug markets and not let it in criminal hands.
Luis, welcome to you, and you are joining us from Canada, where it is snowing, and we are very, very grateful for your input around the report. What is the key message of the report?
Well, thank you, Mark. And it is, in fact, a bit an odd time, and a time for reflection. I think the fact that most of us are now in total isolation has given us more than ever an opportunity to think. I think what this report shows is, despite its purported intentions, the war on drugs, as it was conceived and particularly as it unfolded, to use again a military imagery, has been essentially a war on civilians, and there's been no effort to tackle any of the enemy combatants.
Helen, you've worked in a number of institutions. You've been Prime Minister of New Zealand. How does this report fit in the trajectory of other reports that the Commission has released? So there are common positions, and then there are new issues in this report. Would that be true to say?
This report has a new perspective on the problem of organised crime. Organised crime is a challenge in every society. And if it gets into the political realm and starts corrupting political systems, that is a huge issue. And of course, it has done that. Now, I think where the Commission comes from is that we're saying drugs are being caught up on this because of the refusal of the international community to accept that drugs need to be responsibly regulated. The attempt to prohibit them has actually been a license for organised crime to build a $500 billion a year industry in peddling stuff. Could we take drugs out of that through responsible regulation?
Of course, the Commission has an enormous depth and experience in responding to the range of issues that the report talks about. Violence, corruption, of course, the challenge of organized crime itself. Now, I wonder if I could ask Juan Manuel, your views, having led Colombia, dealt with these issues over time. What would your recommendations be, drawing on the conclusions of the report?
Well, my own experience coming from a country that has fought drug traffickers and drug trafficking for so long and has paid probably the highest cost of any country in the world. Colombia has lost its best leaders, its best journalists, its best judges, its best policemen, and we are still the #1 exporter of cocaine to the world markets. Corruption and drug trafficking go hand in hand. The most dangerous and most protected individuals often escape, while ordinary people who happen to use illicit substances see their lives destroyed by the war on drugs. To fight organized crime, we must follow the money.
So you sense this element of the report would be immediately welcomed, should be welcomed?
I hope so, because people are realizing that a war that has been fought for half a century and has not been won is a war that has been lost. And so you have to change your strategy and change your tactics if you want to be successful. And I use the symbol of a static bicycle. In my country, we've been pedaling and pedaling at a very high cost, very high cost. That's why when I realized that this was not working, I started to discuss ways to change that approach. And this is why I am so happy and proud of being part of this commission.
Juan Manuel, the violence issue comes up again and again in the report as a key harm, something that needs to be reduced by states responding to the issue of organized crime. What was your experience from Colombia? What can be done on this issue?
So it's very closely related. Corruption, violence profits and prohibition. You do away with prohibition, you regulate, you bring the profits down, and immediately you will start to see an improvement in violence and in corruption.
Luis, you yourself have come through the judiciary. What role do you think the judiciary has to play? Of course, you know Canada very well, but around the world, what's your views?
Yeah, I think I can't speak for every country, but what I've seen, and certainly in Canada, it's been crystal clear. When you have bad laws that are misguided, hugely unpopular, and basically not respected by a large number of the population, as was the case in Canada, and as is the case in many parts of the world with respect to criminalization of personal use of drugs, two things happen. First, it erodes the respect for the rule of law more broadly. Because the minute people see that some laws are not worth obeying, it undermines the confidence that that it's in everybody's interest that everybody obeys the law. So it has this pernicious effect on countries that are governed by the rule of law. It's very bad. And it was the case, I think, with respect to personal consumption of marijuana. Widely disregarded prohibition, despite the fact that some of the penalties were unduly harsh. That brings me to unduly harsh penalties. As soon as Canada adopted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, one of the first cases that came to the court where the laws were challenged was the mandatory minimum 7-year sentence for importing narcotics, which could include importing 1 joint of marijuana. A lot of the conversation was, well, it doesn't matter if the law is too harsh, either prosecutors will not use it, they'll bypass it, or judges will find a way. This again instills a culture of non-compliance, which is not good. You want laws that are just, that are fair, that are perceived as such, and then that are applied fairly and equitably. So I think what we've seen, the judiciary, and not just the defense counsel, prosecutors, police officers, we've seen throughout the system a slow resistance to bad laws, and that's not good. I mean, it's good for the person who escapes this unfair punishment, but it's very corrosive for legal systems.
You have a strong human rights background, and clearly the human rights has been central to the message of the Commission. I mean, what's your message in respect of human rights and the fight, if you like, against organized crime?
I stand with the same principles that I would advocate for any form of law enforcement. I think people are entitled to be treated decently by the criminal justice system. They should face penalties that are as harsh as their conduct deserves, which excludes, let me make that clear, recourse to the death penalty. Even for the worst offenders in massive organized crime organization, the death penalty is, in my opinion, never, under any circumstances, an appropriate sentence for drug trafficking, importing, or any other drug-related activities.
Anant, you have a very strong background in human rights. What's your take on this?
Death penalty has to be eased out. But in countries in Asia, we have the largest number of states who have death penalty for offenses, even for possession. In India, we have a slightly different regime. It's quantity based. So if you're a person having small quantity in possession, then technically you can be only imprisoned or sentenced for 1 year. But if you are found with commercial quantity of drugs, then the minimum sentence is 10 years. And if the quantity is commercial quantity on a second sentence, we had mandatory death penalty, but since we actually challenged that provision, it was made discretionary by a court order and then finally by legislation.
Anand, you're a prominent lawyer, and is there a disjuncture between sentences handed down to ordinary users as opposed to what the report calls the criminal elite. Is there a disjuncture between that?
Well, very rarely will you come across a real head of a criminal gang being arraigned in court. It's always the small carriers or the way down the persons who distribute the drugs at the local level, because the success in narcotics is in terms of arrests and seizures. So the police are obviously more keen to get that done. Not only the police, all the other entities also.
This report then really focuses on what it terms the criminal elite. I mean, you've been in the debates of the Commission. I mean, how significant is that in terms of the genesis of the Commission's own thinking?
I think it's really important because in the early works of the Commission, particularly when we got into the very contentious advocacy of complete decriminalization of personal use of all drugs, even in environments that were very sympathetic, as many were in Canada, to the decriminalization of the use of marijuana, when it got to other drugs, there was a lot of resistance. I think the significance of this report is that it makes clear that we're not friends of drugs, and we're not some kind of antique hippies trying to promote free-for-all drug consumption and pretend that it's a good thing. And the significance of this report is that it shows that there is indeed very much a place for law enforcement in drug control. And in combination with that, we have the developments in artificial intelligence, metadata, the capacity of tracking transaction, tracking people, that is unprecedented and gives tools for what we're advocating, which is go after the hard work, not the easy work that you've been doing up to now of arresting people on street corners.
What I see as significant about the report, Helen, is that it makes the same set of powerful recommendations around a health response to drug use, but it also significantly, in my view, for the Commission, focuses on the organized crime elite, the term that the report uses. How can we as a global community respond to that?
If we look at crime in general, there are always social and economic determinants to it. And sometimes we see countries putting enormous emphasis on fighting crime without looking at what are some of the drivers. Is it poverty? Is it marginalisation? Is it school dropouts? It's also about a broader social determinants approach. And I think the Commission has long been an advocate with drug policy of saying, look at the social determinants, look at the real issues, look at the classification. Aren't a number of these things, like cannabis, relatively harmless anyway when compared with legal drugs like tobacco and alcohol? In other words, could we have a real discussion here, not one driven by a simple ideology that drugs are bad, every criminal is, quote, a bad person, when we know all from our personal experiences of people who have ended up as criminals who could have had a different path? I'd like to see a scientific and pragmatic approach, an approach which isn't based on repression.
Ruth, you were saying, as I recall, which I think is an important point, that people fear mixing the levels. So they want to talk about decriminalization. They don't feel they have the expertise necessary at the elite criminal level. So they're nervous of bridging this gap, I suppose.
Yes, what is dramatically lacking in the current drug policy is coherence.
Yeah.
And what we try to bring in the debate is really a search for a coherent policy. And this means that we have really on the different level to show the links between these different levels, to show that the criminalization at the bottom is an obstacle to all the measures we want to have on the health issue, on the development issue, on the social integration issue. But we have also to show that abandoning the market in criminal hands has also terrible consequences for the people. Why is the black market a market where you find fake products, very dangerous products? Why is it that, for instance, if you increase the pressure at the bottom of the pyramid, you will have products that are more dangerous than they were at the beginning? All these consequences, this global picture, I would say. What we need is coherence in this policy to bring together justice, development, health, security, and so many other things, the protection of children, the protection, special protection of women. All this is touched by a failed drug policy, and we have to bring all these pieces together.
And so the issue of corruption, the issue of political party funding, all of these are raised in the report, and they are of great concern to you?
And I said before, let's be very clear. This is about money, huge amounts of money. So it feeds into corruption, money laundering, other forms of trafficking in human beings. All this is interrelated. The difficulty is that there's also a popular culture that glamorizes crime. Whether we look at series like The Sopranos, or there's a sense of distance that these are bad people, but they're kind of smart and fun, and they're out there, and they're not part of my life directly. But for those who don't feel themselves exposed to that, they should understand how much money is sucked out of the current fiscal regime in countries that are in need of money for health, for social security, for education, and these enormous sums of money are taken out of our global pool.
Juan Manuel, what has prevented us or the global community from really getting those guys?
One of the key elements is going after the money. And there you find many obstacles. Among them, the regulations in the banks, the bank secrecy. Many countries don't collaborate as they should to go after these kingpins through the money. There's also a tremendous linkage between drug trafficking and corruption and political corruption. Many times, drug traffickers, what they do is buy the judges or buy the high bureaucrats, and they protect themselves through corruption. And that is another obstacle that we have found. And of course, we have to persevere there if we want to be more effective.
One of the most striking conclusions of the report, in my opinion, is the very strong recommendations that are made around reform of the UN system. And of course, the commissioners themselves have very strong experience of working at senior levels within the UN system. Helen, I wonder if we could get your view on this, around the prospects for reform, what needs to be done, what are the next steps?
For me, as a long-time supporter of the multilateral system, it's grievous that the one place that system lets us down is in this area of driving a prohibitionist agenda on drugs, which criminalizes people who should never be criminalized. We're used to seeing conventions as gold standards of what countries should do. Actually, the conventions are a major problem. But increasingly, countries are walking away from that approach in the practical ways in which they are changing their laws, whether it's states of the United States of America, whether it's Canada, Uruguay, New Zealand, Luxembourg. There are so many countries now that are diverging from the convention. I think what the international system needs to do is get a grip on reality, see drugs as presenting primarily health issues, beef up the WHO to be able to deal with those. That would be a positive thing. Now, one positive since Secretary General Guterres came to office, with the background he had of being very progressive on drug policy as a health issue in Portugal. He got all the agencies round the table at the Chief Executive Board, and they have signed up to a common approach to drug policy. This is fantastic. Now, the issue is for the member states of the UN to drive change in the conventions and in the commissions that make up the member state-based part of the United Nations.
Louise, you two have a long institutional relationship and experience of working within the UN system. What would you suggest, building on what Helen has said, about what we should do?
Everything that has to do with the policies that the Commission is advocating is hard. And some of it that I frankly would have thought almost undoable 10 years ago have been done, such as the decriminalization of personal use of marijuana. And it's been done. And you know what? The Third World War has not started, quite the opposite. And now finally, we have the capacity to do more research about the impact and so on. So I start with that premise because in answer to your question, any kind of reform of a machine that is so entrenched as the UN system is extremely difficult. The main reason it's going to be so hard is because states and governments in particular love law enforcement. The UN is owned by its members. It's an organization of member states. They're kind of the shareholders of the corporation. And they're, as I said before, states love law enforcement. And we shouldn't glorify democracies as being particularly progressive. I mean, democracies are more than maybe other systems hostage to their public opinion. So it's a very big job. I think it has to start, as I said before, from enlisting the few and increasing number of states that are interested.
I want to shift the discussion a little bit to focus on the health implications, an issue the Commission has long looked at. Louise, could I bring you in here? What would you say about, what would be the key points to politically, if you like, to push forward a discussion like this?
Well, in a sense, I think, again, the current pandemic has put an enormous spotlight on the right to health.
Yeah.
And this is at the heart of what the work of the Commission has been right from the beginning. Our very, very early efforts to penetrate this war on drug and this repressive culture was to say we need to shift from law enforcement to health. That if the UN office that is called the UN Office of Drugs and Crime had been called the UN Office of Drugs and Health, we would probably be having a very different conversation today. So our work early on was to shift from, to start seriously looking at people. And I think the current pandemic is opening that conversation.
Helen, I wonder if I could ask you on the issue of prison populations. There's been a lot in the media around this particular issue and the pandemic, what your views would be.
One of the concerns, of course, as the pandemic rolls out across countries is what happens when it gets into institutions like our prisons. Now, one of the long-time concerns of the Global Commission on Drug Policy has been the extraordinary number of people who are incarcerated for non-violent, so-called offending against unjust drug laws which follow a prohibitionist approach. Here in a pandemic, a number of jurisdictions are thinking nothing of letting these low-risk prisoners go, which raises the issue of why were they ever there? What point was being made? And I hope as we move out of the pandemic, that may cause authorities to think again about what were we doing ever locking up those people in the first place. So there's an old saying, it's an ill wind that blows no good. This pandemic is a shockingly ill will. But if out of it could come some reflections on what could be done better, like stopping locking people up for things they should never be in prison for, perhaps we could make some more progress.
Luis, looking forward, in the next 5 years, what what would be your wish list for what you would want to see?
The work of the Commission, I think, had several pathways, and I hope we're going to see progress in many. Some are much more advanced than others. The putting people first, harm reduction, right to health, and so on is moving very nicely, I think, in many countries in the right direction. The report that we're putting out today is the hardest. It's the hardest, not in terms of the desirability of attacking transnational organized crime. I think it's an idea that everybody would think is a great idea. Operationally, in the current system, with resources being so grossly misapplied to the other end of the spectrum and so on, it's going to be very difficult. But I think a space will open that will make that more plausible. And in that case, I think that 10 years of work of the Commission will serve as a very useful blueprint for these kinds of reforms.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks a lot. I appreciate very much the exchange. The debate that we've heard today is unbelievably important from a range of experts, ex-presidents that have been focusing on this issue for really a very long time. The significance of this report now at this time, in my view, can't be underestimated. And so I give the last word to Ruth, the chairperson of the Commission, given her own long track record in this area and her commitment to the issue of finding an alternative way forward in the area of drug policy. Ruth, over to you.
To my fellow commissioners, it is an experience that I never had, I would say, on the international level, to have people who, in a great modesty, very humble people, even if they had high responsibility, trying to understand an issue and to find solution and to bring them to the people. So thank you to all. You will find it on our website. Our report is translated now in 7 languages, and I hope it will be useful also for your fight against the failure of drug policy, the failure of prohibition.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you to all.